Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this short session for 30 minutes. I want to talk about diversity in teams, which of course is a very topical subject, diversity overall. But what I want to talk about today is a different type of diversity. And I really want to talk about diversity of thinking styles. I mean, when we talk about diversity, of course, we immediately think about ethnicity. We think about male, female, we think about those sorts of things, which is, of course, the very traditional and important aspects of diversity. But I also think that one of the neglected areas of diversity that we really haven't touched on too much is the concept of how people think. So, for example, you have people who, in terms of diversity, are blue sky thinkers. And you have, on the other hand, people who are very much in the detail. So that's diversity. Or we might have people who are introvert by personality type and extrovert. Well, that's diversity. And your team and everyone's team is made up of those sorts of thinking styles. And I think that this is a largely untapped area in teams. And I think it's an area that certainly could be given more attention. And I'm hoping that I can further that discussion today in our short session together. So I'll just share my screen and then we'll launch into the presentation. So those of you who don't know me, Tim Baker's my name, and you can see that I do a number of things. I am an author of 13 books. My 13th book should be out sometime very soon. And you can see I also give keynote addresses. I also do workshops, executive coaching, and I still play in the Golden Oldies rugby competition here in Brisbane, which, we only play every second week because it takes 2 weeks to recover. And you can see that gentleman chasing me. You can see why I'm, who wouldn't have a bit of speed if someone like that was chasing you, but never mind. That's a vivid memory. Anyway, let's launch into the topic. This information comes from one of my books, Winning Teams, the 8 Characteristics of High-Performing Teams. And I've received a number of nice endorsements from people in the world of sport, including people such as Tom Lawton, people such as Grant Fox, the legendary New Zealand All Black, and of course, Nick Farr-Jones, and also from the Commissioner of the Queensland Police, Katarina Carroll. And Nick Farr-Jones had some nice words to say about my book, which I thoroughly appreciate. And of course, he was a legend in the game of rugby. But you don't have to be an expert on rugby to enjoy the book. I've just used some anecdotes in there that would be of interest to anyone, I guess, that enjoys sport overall. And of course, a lot of those lessons in the world of sport are applicable in the world of business as well. So let's look at probably one of the objections that people would have when we start talking about diversity in a team. And that is that, how can I do anything about diversity when I have a team that's already formed? And I would suspect that that's most of you. And what that means, of course, is there's not much you can do about the composition of a team. You are perhaps you just inherited the team you've got, and that's that. But remember, I'm talking about a different form of diversity today, and I'm talking about diversity of thinking styles. So that's what I want to focus on today, because there is something you can definitely do about that. So what I'm going to talk about is this concept of diversity of thinking styles in your team. And I'll spend a bit of time going through that. And then what I'd like to do is share with you some very simple and useful tips on managing diversity in your team with a reference, of course, to thinking styles. And at the end of this presentation, I've got a special offer for you. So that's what will take us through for our short time together. Now, in my book, Winning Teams, the 8 Characteristics of High-Performing Teams, I come up with 8 characteristics of high-performing teams. Now, what you can see there in front of you is the 8 characteristics around the outside of the model. Now, you can see I've got an arrow pointed to utilize diversity. That is one of the characteristics of high-performing teams. And one of the things that I've found from my own observations as a consultant and also just researching this topic is that the teams that are high-performing often do really utilize this concept of diversity in their team. And I obviously want to talk about how you can do that in your team. So that's the area we'll focus on today. Obviously, the other 7 characteristics you can read about in my book. Okay, so let's have a look at this model here, this model here comes from Team Management Systems, which is a Brisbane-based organization that I use very regularly when I'm working with teams. And I use it because it's a great model. It's a great model to reflect the different types of diversity that can be in a team when it comes to thinking styles. So let me explain that for you. You'll see that in the wheel, as they call it, there are 8 types of diversity of thinking, or 8 tasks that need to be done. So what I want you to do here is just separate functional roles. So everyone's got a functional role in the team, of course, and that's very important, and people are expected to do those functional roles. And your job is, of course, to make sure that they do follow through on those things. But the other thing I would say to you is that there is another type of role that people play in teams, one that's not quite so obvious and clear, and that is the way people think. So, for example, when you get your team together and have a conversation with your team, you'll probably notice that people will contribute in certain ways in that conversation. You know, some people, of course, will dive into the detail. Other people will look at the big picture. Other people will be quite structured, and other people will be more flexible. Now, all of those things are relevant, and if they're harnessed correctly, instead of annoying us, if they're harnessed correctly, it can improve the quality of the team. Now, the way I would illustrate this is if you just imagine for a moment that all of us in this webinar today were shipwrecked on a desert island. Let's imagine that we were all sitting around a campfire. Let's imagine that we're all going to have a conversation about what we're going to do next. Now, of course, there'd be 2 topics of conversation. One, of course, is how are we going to get off this island? How are we going to get rescued? And the other topic, of course, would be on how do we survive while we're here? And each person around that campfire would probably contribute in different ways. For example, someone might say, let's go up to the mountain and sort of survey where we are and let's look at the terrain. Other people might say, well, let's get a list of priorities and work out what's important and work towards those. Another person might say that I've read a book about this and I've got, there were a couple of interesting comments that came out of it. So we'd all have our contribution to make. Because remember, in that situation, none of us would have functional roles. So the only roles we'd really have is the way we'd want to contribute in the team. So let me share with you these 8 roles. And while I'm doing this, I'd like you to have a think about which role you perhaps feel most comfortable exhibiting. And perhaps you might also think about the team members in your team and, who might exhibit that role. So if we start over here on the advising role, whenever you've got something to do in your team, like a project to achieve or whatever, the very first thing you need is advice in terms of, information about what has to happen, some deadlines, what resources are available, what the problem is. There's a whole range of information that you need, and advisors are often people who like to seek out that information. We also then, once we've got all the information we need, we also then have to start to be innovative in terms of how we're going to solve the problem. And of course, you know, in our world of work, there are often ways of doing things, but there are also opportunities for us to think outside the square for a time being and to consider other ways that might work. So we need to toss around some ideas about how best to move forward. Then once we've done that, we've then got to start promoting what we're doing to our stakeholders and perhaps the people that may be working, you know, that are our direct reports. We need to communicate what we're doing across the board. We have to communicate what our intent is and how we'll intend to go about it. And if we do that well, we've got a situation then where we've got to start developing some sort of an action. And we've got to develop and assess a number of ways forward. And the conversation needs to sort of narrow down our options to consider some ways that we might deal with the problem at hand. Now, while we're doing that, of course, or after we've done that, we've now got to organize a plan. Now, the plan, of course, is really a situation where we start to turn a concept into reality. So we need people who will organize and move us in the right direction. Now, you might say, well, surely that would be me as the team leader. But just bear in mind, you have your own preferences about how you'd like to contribute in a team. And that preference may not include organizing, in which case there might be somebody else in the team that's probably more capable of doing that. And then, of course, the next step is we've got to produce results, because without results, we haven't done anything really. So we have to actually decide on achieving certain milestones and getting things done in certain ways. So we've got to basically produce results. And then when the project's completed, we've actually got to do a little bit of navel gazing, if you like, and start to look back on what we've done so that we can learn the lessons from the past. So what did we do well? And how might we use that again in the future? And what didn't go so well? And how might we change our approach next time? And so, you know, and often people, you know, the inspector in the team will often be drawing our attention to that. Now, all the while, we've also got to maintain our team standards as a team. How do we operate and how should we operate? The maintainer in the team will often remind us of what we need to do as a team and what promises we've made to ourselves in terms of how we do things. So you can see there's a logic to the approach there, and I'm suggesting that instead of just simply, you know, going through our functional roles, we should also harness and utilize the way people think in our teams. Now, of course, you know, you may say, well, I'm not too sure where people might sit around the wheel. And if you're interested, you can certainly do the team management profile. All you've got to do is send me an email, and you can organize to do this, and I can facilitate a workshop for you online or basically face-to-face, depending on where you are. But what that would do was give you some certainty around where people fit in around that wheel. It's highly likely, of course, that not every one of those different roles will be filled by someone who has a natural tendency to want to communicate within that role. And so therein lies some potential opportunities for your team to work out how you might so-called plug the gaps. So it's a great model, and it's well worth having a think about and how you might actually exercise that in terms of how you go about things. Okay, now let me talk about diversity in terms of your team. And what I will do is finish up talking about some things that you can do, very practical things that you can do to get yourself moving in the right direction, just to get that little extra edge in your team. So greater diversity in team composition can now be a competitive differentiator, and it shifts the market share to more diverse companies over time. We now have research that shows that teams that are actually more diverse outperform teams that are not. Now, for a while, we've thought that that's possibly the case, but we now have clear research to demonstrate that that, in fact, is the case. So obviously, diversity is not just a case of doing the right thing. It's also a case of economic imperative as well. So, you've got basically two reasons, two very, very valid reasons to start looking at diversity in your team. So let's have a look at some more information about that. I mentioned there is research about this. Companies in the top quartile for racial and ethnic diversity, for example, are 35% more likely to have financial returns above their respective national industry medians. Now, there's been a comprehensive research in this area, and it's not just in this country or one country. It's been done in the UK, it's been done in America, it's been done in Australia, in other parts of the world. And the results have been quite amazing, that to indicate that, it's not hard to do this, because you look at comparisons across industries and then you look at diversity in the teams, and that's not hard to measure. It's very evident. And then look at the financial returns at the end. And so that's what the research is telling us. Now, of course, the bad news is, if I could just go back at the opposite end of the scale, companies in the bottom quartile, both for gender and for ethnic and race, are statistically less likely to achieve above average financial returns. So the evidence is very, very clear. And you could probably understand at a very intuitive level why that is the case, because obviously if you've got diversity in your team, it's likely that a greater array of perspectives are brought to bear on the problems that the team has to solve. And if the leader, if you are skillful and in managing your team, and you're prepared to share the leadership, it's likely that that will contribute to those financial returns. So there's some indirect benefits around diversity as well. Look, apart from the obvious, which is those significant financial benefits, a more diverse place is better for attracting top talent, because if you've got diversity in your team, then it's likely that people who are, in minorities might be a little bit more encouraged to apply. But whereas if you've got a homogeneous team, it might be that ethnic minority, for example, may think, well, I won't bother applying because I may not fit in. So it certainly contributes to your capacity to build, to attract good talent, top talent. The team's capacity to commit and engage externally is also increased, because it means that your team can be in a better position to understand the array of concerns and perspectives that your customers and stakeholders may have, because they can put themselves in their shoes. And of course, and I think the most obvious of the three, is that you can create a better decision-making process, provided people feel comfortable contributing, and you as the leader do make people feel comfortable contributing, and your team members are also comfortable with a diverse array of inputs in your team decision making. So obviously there are some significant benefits indirectly as well as directly. Now, here's a couple of things just to sort of, get to the end of what we're doing here. Here are some simple things that I would suggest that you do in your team. They're simple in the sense that it doesn't take much effort, but it can give you maximum return on effort. Now, the first point there is that I think, obviously I said earlier, you've probably inherited a team, so it's probably likely there's not much you can do about its composition. So I would suggest to you that if you are in the position where you can form a team, it might be a project team, or it could be that you've got the luxury to be able to pick and choose the members of your team, then the obvious place to start is right at the beginning of team formation, is to make a conscious effort right at the beginning to make sure that you've got diversity in your team. And if you can do that, then clearly you're off to a good start, because it's obviously much harder to do that at a later stage when the team's set and you've got your people on board. So the first principle would be to start early and to make a conscious effort to engage diversity in your team. Now, don't misunderstand me. Obviously, you want the technical people, you want technical capability, of course. So first and foremost, you need to fill your functional roles. However, within the recruitment and selection process in those functional roles, if you've got a couple of people who have got really good skill sets and would make a contribution to your team in a functional capacity, you might then start to consider issues of diversity in terms of who you might select. Now, there's a bit of a paradox in this, because people who think alike and are alike can often have harmonious relationships in teams, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're effective. So the idea is that you probably want an effective team, and hopefully they'll work harmoniously together as well. But I think effectiveness is the key, and that's what you're after all. Now, small changes can make a big difference. And what that means is that when you do get the opportunity to replace someone in your team, so, inevitably there's going to be turnover in your team, as there is in any team, the idea would be for you to be conscious of that. And when you do replace that person, is to think carefully about diversity. Now, of course, if you're working in a remote area and it's almost impossible to get somebody to join your team, or you don't get many applications, that's what I guess I'm saying, then of course you've got little choice. You have to take what you've got. But I think in many cases, when we advertise for a job and we're recruiting and selecting, we often have several candidates we can choose from. And in those cases, if you find somebody who perhaps thinks a little bit differently, has a different sort of background, maybe male, female, maybe race, whatever, you should consciously think very carefully about including them, assuming, of course, they've got the right technical skills. And by making that small change, you'll make a significant difference in your team. So that's your window of opportunity when you've got a well-established team. Now, there are two things that you can do. The first one's not so easy, but the second one is very easy, because we all have people leaving teams. Now, what about diversity beyond the team? So exposing a homogeneous team to alternative perspectives is very, very powerful and often neglected. So how do you do that? Well, you can use speakers who might have a provocative view about obviously your functional area. And you can bring those people in, and these days, of course, it's not hard to Zoom somebody into a meeting. So you can bring those people in virtually or physically. You can bring them into the team and ask them to share their perspective, which may not be the perspective that the rest of your team shares. Now, that will create, hopefully, a different thought process. Hopefully, it might just alert people to the fact that there are other ways of thinking about the problem. And that is a good thing, because what you're doing is you're challenging your team to think about things in a different way. So I'd recommend you try that. Now, the final one is a bit tough, because the fact is you should be calling out bias when you see it. And if you're attuned to it, you will probably come across a biased comment every day. And I think as a team leader, when you recognize it, you should be encouraged or should be courageous enough to tackle it. Why? Because obviously, if you don't tackle it, or even if you're unaware, what's going to happen, of course, is that you are sending a message tacitly that that view is acceptable. Now, the point is that if you don't challenge it, people will assume that it's okay to. Now, it depends, of course, on what it is that people say, but my view is that if you see it, you should say something about it. Now, I don't think it's a case of embarrassing the person in front of the rest of the team. I think that's probably a little too far. But I think I'd pull that person aside and I'd talk to them about that and I'd challenge them about that view. Because this is part of what a leader does. And, you know, the old adage of what you walk past, you accept. And I think it's very, very true in terms of this as well as anything else. So be courageous, pull it up, let people know that it's unacceptable and explain to them why. And I think if you do that, you will be training people to consider being less biased than they probably would normally be. And I think that's very, very important. So there's some very simple tips that you can apply in your own team context that will work well for you. Now, as many of you will be aware, because you're loyal and regular followers, and I really appreciate that, next Friday, I've got a very interesting webinar on a world without work. And you'll notice I've got a question mark there. There's a great book out called A World Without Work by Daniel Susskind, who's an economist from Oxford who is really, it's a very popular book, and he has crunched some numbers, and it's a very interesting read. He argues that the rate of technology is such that sooner or later, and he doesn't mean it's going to happen in the next couple of years, but he's arguing that sooner or later there will be a situation where there just simply isn't enough work for we human beings, because machines are becoming more and more capable, smart machines, on a regular basis. So I'd love you to join me next week at 10 o'clock Australian Eastern Standard Time, and I'll share with you some of the material in that book, and I'll also share with you some of my own personal views about that topic, because it's quite a sobering read, I can assure you. And there's no easy solution if that does, in fact, unfold. So there's the link, and all you've got to do, of course, I'll be sending you a copy of the slides and the recording at the end of this presentation. And all you've got to do, of course, is click on that link as you did today, and you're in. And finally, just a quick plug, my book, Winning Teams, is available, and you can purchase that book at a discount. All you've got to do is send me an email, and I will send you a code and give you a chance to purchase that book today. Usually $35 inclusive of postage, $25 inclusive of postage. Just send me an email. I'm happy to organize that for you, and I'll sign the book and send it out for you as well. So folks, that's it from me. I'll just stop sharing for a moment. I hope you found that a little thought-provoking, and just to empower you a little bit to realize that there are some things you can do about diversity in your team, even though it might not seem possible, and that diversity can contribute not just to the betterment of the team, but also to the bottom line. And I'd encourage you to apply some of the strategies that I've suggested today. So thanks everyone for your time. I look forward to catching up next week on Friday, and we can talk about a very interesting topic about a world without work. Thanks everyone, all the best, and have a wonderful weekend. We'll catch you next week. Thank you and goodbye.